All right. Restarting this. Probably missed the first part of the show, but it's not. You can hear that on Blog Talk Radio or even Truth Radio. They've got their archives working. And the first part was of this video, what was supposed to be the first part of this video, was on Gordon Duff's view of the Russian-Syrian wars and how the finger of blame and the bad guys were our own Pentagon, not Russia. And this is kind of what I've told you too. I think we're being moved into the position that if we support freedom, if we support liberty, if we don't support the terrorists, then Russia is the only Vladimir Putin is the only one out there that is actually confronting the real terrorists. We are supporting the terrorists against Assad. Doesn't matter who we supported them against Gaddafi. We supported them, al-Qaeda, and now ISIS, the Israeli Security Intelligence Service. That's ISIS, and we're backing them. Now, what I'm talking about here is Eustace Mullins. Eustace was a friend, and Ezra Pound was supporting the Italians, was supporting Mussolini, was supporting trying to tell the German side of it, of the whole World War II conflict, and pointing the finger at the Jews. And he was arrested, brought home, put in an insane asylum for quite a few years. Eustace Mullins talks about what he learned and how he learned it. He said, though it seems unbelievable now, during the height of World War II, there was more widespread dissemination of patriotic material on the Jewish conspiracy than there is today. Many dedicated patriots turned out small papers which printed the hard facts. They had long since learned how to survive the daily harassment by FBI agents, ADL agents, and hordes of other home front guardians. They were frequently denounced by the paid press. After reading one of these hysterical attacks, I sent Gerald K. Smith $25 for some material. This was a large sum at the time. My pay was only $50 a month. By return mail, I received a large box containing several hundred copies of the Cross and the Flag. This is the first material, Eustace Mullins says, I had ever encountered on the Jewish problem. It contained many astounding revelations. I realized at once that this was not the type of material to be quoted in the usually barracks discussion. Several soldiers had commented that there were informers in the barracks. Although I did not then make the connection, there was to be found in almost every barracks a particularly obnoxious Jew, usually with a Brooklyn accent. Never occurred to me that these Jews were being as obnoxious as possible in order to goad the other soldiers into making anti-Semitic remark. Nor did it occur to me that these Brooklyn Jews often had college degrees. At that time, everyone with a college background was ordered to try out for the officer candidate school. I did not realize that these Brooklyn Jews remained with the enlisted men for surreptitious reasons. This type of political subversion of the troops is part of the Jewish communist strategy. It was meticulously observed in the American armed forces during World War II. In combat zones, officers and enlisted men who had previously voiced doubts about the wisdom of Roosevelt's crusade to save communism were shot in the back by the same intelligence agents who had followed them into the front lines. When General Eisenhower was cozily tucked away in his British Secret Service, chauffeur cozily tucked away with his British Secret Service chauffeur Kay Summersby. The real decisions were made by his liaison officer, Captain Warburg of the Kuhn and Loeb banking house, a Jewish concern. The communist control over the United States Army surfaced during World War II with the selection of General George C. Marshall as Chief of Staff. As Senator Joseph McCarthy later pointed out, Marshall was under Communist Party discipline at all times. This did not interfere with his direction of our war efforts, since the goals of the Washington Marxists were the same: the total defeat of the German anti-communist forces in the Korean and Vietnam wars. The communist direction of our armed forces remained unchanged, even though we were fighting against communist forces. When General Douglas MacArthur tried to oppose this communist betrayal of our men, he was fired by David Niles, the Jewish communist who was President Truman's aide. The communists recognized that final political control always resided in the military. In Moscow and in Washington, every officer is absolutely responsive to the current ideological line, regardless of any military consideration. This was very recently demonstrated when every officer on active duty was ordered to support the giveaway of the Panama Canal, while many retired officers openly opposed it. The most stringent measures were carried out to ensure that no officer is able to form a group to discuss and possibly take action against the high treason of his superiors. When Commander George Lincoln Rockwell surfaced at the Pentagon, there was consternation throughout the high command. At the least sign of any independence or patriotic speech from any officer, the Jewish-controlled media immediately raised a hue and cry about fascism, and the offenders quickly neutralized. After receiving the supply of Smith's magazine, I distributed them in the day rooms to see who would read them. The next day, I toured the day rooms to see if anyone would read them, and perhaps to strike up a conversation. Every issue had disappeared. Not once did I see a copy while I remained on the base. And folks, that's what they do. When I was working with Charles Collins, when he was running for president, I would get to the Republican convention the night before, and I would put up Collins for president signs between the Dole and the Bush or Dole and Buchanan and the Allen Keyes signs. By the next morning, everyone was gone, and of course, as I've told you, anytime Charles Collins got to stand up in the Republican convention to tell them about how we could take back the Federal Reserve and wipe out this bogus national debt that we've got, every camera was turned off, and in 2 instances his microphone was unplugged. Now, Eustace says, he said, apparently I had been followed and the papers picked up as fast as I had left them. During my remaining years of military service, I encountered no one with strong political views. My own opinions were those of a young man of the period, hardly committed to any strong ideology. After the war, I enrolled in Washington and Lee University, intending to study law. After 2 years, I decided to go to art school and enrolled in the Institute of Contemporary Arts in Washington, D.C. The school had the usual mongrel types in its student body and a number of ardent communists on the staff, but it attracted many of the leading writers as speakers. Like others among the 10 million veterans, my main concern was in getting on with my career. I had little concern about politics. Overnight, my lack of concern changed. One of the teachers at the Institute had been visiting Ezra Pound. He suggested that I accompany him one afternoon and offer that rather disturbed me. I thought it was unlikely that the man who had edited T.S. Eliot and Ernest Hemingway would be interested in talking to me, but I went along. The moment I entered the gloom of the insane ward, my former complacence vanished, never to return. I suddenly realized that a great writer had been punished by being confined in a madhouse solely for his political views. In an instant, Pound filled the ideological gap in my life. Never again would I remain silent in the face of injustice. The famous American poet had been convicted of treason in revealing in radio broadcasts that World War II had been started by international Jewry to further its own ends of world domination. He was kept 13 years in a lunatic asylum in a urine-soaked cell, originally in solitary confinement and forced to wear a straitjacket. Only much later he was allowed to receive visitors as Mullins. Pound apparently considered me, Mullins says, a kindred spirit and offered to give me my own day, that is, an afternoon to visit him alone each week. I accepted, and by the time the week rolled around, he was waiting for me with food, assignments for research, and errands to run. Shortly afterwards, he brought up the Federal Reserve System, which I had never heard of. From that day, my work was cut out for me. His concern for his country was aptly expressed by Charles Dickens in his American Notes, written a century earlier. I do fear that the heaviest blow ever dealt to liberty will be dealt by this country in its failure to be an example to the earth. The loss of liberty in America, which occurred before our eyes, means the autocracy will be enthroned throughout the world, and that freedom, which was ours at our birth, will never be known by future generations. Olga Ivinskaya, a Russian writer, writes of her years in a Soviet prison camp. Singarian, a fellow inmate, had put down the story of her life in her awkward, uneven handwriting. She came from a working-class family, and her father, long since dead, had taken part in the revolution of 1917. For this, she heaped curses upon his memory. As in the usual hogwash about aristocrats, we never stopped to think it was the working people of Russia, not aristocrats, who were enslaved by the communist revolution. Similarly, in this country is the Jewish intellectuals, bankers, and industrialists who are in the forefront of the battle to enslave all Americans and take away their freedom forever. Should we allow this, the future generations in concentration camp will begin their days not with prayers, but with curses on our memories. I soon began to visit Ezra Pound every day, a routine which I kept up for 3 years. During this time, I was thoroughly grounded in every aspect of the international communist conspiracy. Pound said to me, "I am telling you things I didn't know until I was 50. You're 25, which means you're getting an extra 25 years to do something about it." When I went to New York, bankers on Wall Street told me I was here during the crash, but I didn't know what was going on until I read your book. I explained that I had the benefits of Pound's experience and his access to much information in Europe, which had already been banned in the United States. To support myself while writing the history of the Federal Reserve, I obtained a job at the Library of Congress as a stack attendant. This was the same job J. Edgar Hoover had held for several years while he completed his law studies at George Washington University Night School. A few weeks later, because I had done advanced photographic studies at the Institute, I was promoted to the photography department. In the next several months, I received 2 more promotions as I had studied with one of the finest Japanese photographers. During these months, I was able to see Pound only on weekends, and he suggested I send some of my writings to the Social Creditor, a small weekly published in England. I sent them some articles which they printed, sending me enthusiastic comments. One day, while going into the National Press Club for my daily luncheon with George Stimson, a man was handing out copies of Common Sense at the front door. I showed it to Pound, an issue containing the Hermann Goering's Testament. He suggested I send them articles. They printed some excerpts from the Federal Reserve research. One afternoon, a Jew came into the Library of Congress asking for me. I was called out of the dark room to see a Jew who was a caricature out of Der Stürmer. He immediately began to cross-question me, saying he had been sent from Common Sense, and he asked, "Who's giving you your material? Where's this material coming from?" Not wishing to involve Pound, who always faced the possibility of having his daily visitors turned away and being held incommunicado, I explained I was doing research at the Library of Congress. It was obvious that he did not believe me. A gawky, small-town boy could hardly be privy to the machinations of the world's most powerful and secretive bankers. A team of FBI agents was now sent to the Library of Congress to question everyone who had worked with me. Senator Herman Lehman of Lehman Brothers Banking House and the national chairman of the Anti-Defamation League sent a demand to Luther Evans, Librarian of Congress, that I be fired because of an article I had written for the Social Creditor. The demand, written on ADL stationery, had been drawn up by an ADL operator, Edelstein, and signed by Lehman without reading it, as he accepted anything which Edelstein brought to him. The article exposed the fact that one Katz, Marshall Plan Administrator, presided over most of the Marshall Plan material to communist countries instead of sending it to the non-communist countries for which Congress had designed it. In other words, because of Jewish machinations, money intended by Congress to help non-communist countries was secretly diverted to communist countries where the sole beneficiaries were international Jewry. This was, of course, fraud and peculation on an unimaginable scale, comparable to the mysterious disappearing of $3 trillion when Rabbi Dov Zakheim was in charge of financial affairs at the Pentagon in 2001. And, of course, this was in my March issue of the Free American. I exposed Rabbi Dov Zakheim in the issue with the building number 7 on the cover, for which I almost lost my life. Eustace goes on to say, neither of them dared to publicly argue the point, as it would have exposed the fact that the Marshall Plan was going to the communists. Although I as yet knew nothing of the ADL order that I be fired, I had had a previous contact with Senator Lehman. Pound had noticed an advertisement in the Washington Post that Lehman would be speaking at Howard University on behalf of Home Rule, a plan to wrest control of the District of Columbia from a group of white businessmen and turn it over to the Negroes. Howard University was the communist training school for Ralph Bunche and many other Negro Marxists. Through the dogged influence of Eleanor Roosevelt, it was the only college in the United States whose entire budget was provided by the federal government. Pound mentioned that Lehman, a typical Jewish degenerate with a nervous tic, had suggested it would be amusing to see it in action. When Dave Horton and I arrived at the Howard University auditorium, we found a group of Negroes, 8 or 10, the entire audience for the August senator, rather put out by the poor attendance. Lehman, a short, squat, old clothes dealer type, made a short speech about Home Rule and opened the floor to question. Immediately, Horton and I were on our feet. Would Lehman Brothers consider the District of Columbia a safe investment? Asked Horton. Will you support Alger Hiss to be the first mayor of Washington? I asked. Lehman, a rather stupid Jew, was completely bewildered by our questions. We continued to fire questions at him as his aides, 2 young city college Jews, shook their fists at us. The famed Lehman tic now made its appearance. It was not merely a tic of the eyes. The entire left side of his face was twitching steadily and violently. The audience of Negroes was glaring at us, muttering shame as Lehman's aides rushed him away. Later I learned in the foyer of the Lehman Mansion in New York, a splendid 14th century statue of the Virgin Mary, looted from one of the great cathedrals of Europe, stood near the door. For the titillation of visitors, a cigarette was placed dangling in her mouth. And that's the Jews' idea of the Holy Virgin Mary. After a few days, few days after our college Howard University evening, I was handed a letter of dismissal from the Library of Congress. The FBI interrogations had turned up nothing which could be used against me, and had caused considerable angry comment from among other employees. The letter stated I was being dismissed because I had written an article for the Social Creditor. I was given the option of making a personal appeal to the librarian, which I did. In Evans' office, he asked me, "Did you write this article?" "Yes," I replied. "Can you show me one false statement in it?" "I'm not competent to do that," said Evans. "That's out of my hands. Your dismissal stands." "But I am not a member of any political group," I protested. "I've never voted in my life. You have many staff members that are active members of militant racial organizations. You have 2 staff members who do nothing but go through stacks, writing numbers, bets all day. Why am I being singled out?" Evans, who never once looked me in the eye, opened a bottom drawer of his desk where I glimpsed a half-empty bottle of Country Gentleman of bourbon. He looked at it longingly, looked at it, turned to me and said, "Well, that's all." My next job at the Chicago Motor Club, I became editor of Motor News with a circulation of 250,000. During the next 2 years, I willingly took on additional duties as editor of the Industrial Editors News Service, Public Relations Counselor, Special Events Organizer. I had been at the club 2 years and 1 week with a drawer full of memorandums from my superior, James E. Bulger, praising my work and thanking me for my new programs, when one sultry afternoon 2 well-dressed men strode by Bulger's secretary, went to his office, and closed the door. His secretary, who was a close friend, turned to me and said, "I wonder what that's all about." "Never saw them before," I replied. The men stayed with Bulger for half an hour. I could hear them arguing with him, but their voices were kept low. Finally, he buzzed the secretary. She went in and came out immediately, handed me a folded note. I opened it and read, "You are allowed 5 minutes to get your things out of the office." "What's going on?" the secretary asked me. I saw the tears were streaming down her face. I showed her the note. "I know what's in it," she said, "but what's going on?" "Mr. Bulger's sick. We got to help him." Those men, she turned and ran into the restroom. I put some personal memorandum into the envelope and left the office. That evening, Bulger's secretary called me at home. She told me that the 2 men were FBI agents, and when they demanded I be fired, Bulger frontally refused. This was understandable, as I was doing the work of 4 people. Then they threatened him for nearly an hour. He had 5 heart attacks in the past several years, and he began to writhe in pain. He begged them to call him let him call his doctor. "Certainly," one of the men replied, "as soon as you fire Mullins." Bulger was then forced to write the note. As I left the office, the FBI agents accompanied Bulger to the doctor's, then took him home after warning him not to tell me what had happened or give me my job back. Being fired from the Chicago Motor Club was the greatest shock of my life. Certainly, this was the goal of FBI harassment. At the age of 35, I had been one of the most active public relations counselors in Chicago, lunching at the best restaurants with the city's leading executives. I was now on the street with no prospects. Even so, I supposed that with my contacts I would be able to get another public relations job. In the next several weeks, I was surprised to learn that after each interview I heard nothing about a job. Friends at the motor club then told me because of the pressure from the club's Jewish member, Bulger was telling everyone who inquired about references that I was a notorious criminal who was wanted in several states. He never put this into writing, giving out the slander on the phone after instructions from the Jew who was the club's legal counselor. Since I was fired from the Chicago Motor Club in August of 1958, I've never again been able to get a professional job. And folks, same thing is true to me. I filed an application for an editor. I've got plenty of experience. Not a word from them. Eustace goes on to say, after several weeks, I realized it was unlikely I would get any work in Chicago. I began to work on a book about Friedrich Nietzsche while doing research at the Newberry Library. I found a great deal of material on Ezra Pound's career. I wrote him suggesting that I do his biography. He immediately replied he'd been waiting for me to do this and that I was his only authorized biographer. I then asked Henry Reseny if he could give me an advance on this book. He replied he could not, though he owned the largest window shade factory in the country, a bank, and other holdings worth $80 million. He suggested, however, that H.L. Hunt needed someone to edit a book. I called Hunt and he agreed to pay me $100 a week. I said I couldn't live on that. In fact, I was living on $35 a week. Hunt now offered to let me live in his home. At that time, Hunt's income was $10 million a week, and he had accumulated a fortune of $3 billion. I arrived at Hunt's home in Dallas with one battered suitcase and an old Plymouth purchased a year before for $100, with the entire front end smashed in. Hunt and I immediately established complete rapport, as he had lived for years out of a suitcase, traveling in backcountry, picking up oil leases, which was the basis of his fortune. I resided in his best guest room, which had always been occupied previously by Senator Joe McCarthy when he came to Dallas. Hunt and I settled down to work on the book Alpaca. After several months of intensive work, the book was completed and I became restless. By this time, Hunt had installed me in an office next to his own, and whenever someone called him, he would say, "Why don't you check with Mullins on that?" I realized he was only using me as a buffer, but it was a flattering situation for a penniless writer to be referred to as the confidential assistant of the world's richest man. However, I remained a penniless writer, and he remained the world's richest man. I began to realize I should be getting back to work with the Pound biography. And one afternoon, I told him I had to return to Chicago. He was completely surprised, and I saw that he was hurt and disappointed in my decision. Nevertheless, I've always thought of him with affection and admiration. He seemed well disposed to me on later occasions when I talked to him in Dallas and New York. Although I knew nothing of it at the time, my association with W.L. Hunt had driven the Jews into a furious campaign of harassment against my parents. The conspirators were terrified that Hunt might finance my publications or political organization, though at the time I had no organization to which he might donate money. I knew that my father had a serious coronary attack in 1956, but I was not told until years later that the attack had been brought on by a series of vicious interrogations by Army Counterintelligence Corps agents. My mother later told me they were determined to make my father reveal the names of persons financially supporting my travels and writings. Since no one had ever given me a cent, there was nothing he could tell them, but they refused to believe him. Knowing he had Wednesdays afternoons off from the store in which he worked, two agents waited for him in his car. They forced him into the car, drove him to the top of a nearby mountain, and interrogated him for 7 hours, telling him they were going to throw him off the mountain. At one point, he tried to escape from the car. They knocked him unconscious and drove him back to the store, left him in the parked car. He came to, drove home. The next day, he had a severe coronary attack from which he never completely recovered. My parents did not dare tell me all these details out of the desire to protect me. They knew I would kill someone for these atrocities. Nevertheless, they knew I had been interrogated. I knew they had been interrogated, and I wrote to the Secretary of Defense. I received an answer admitting that my father had been interrogated, giving the names of two men who interrogated him. Some weeks later, I tried to contact these men in Washington. I was told they had been sent on a mission to Guam and that the plane had crashed with all aboard. The letter with the men's name has since disappeared from my files. While I was with H.L. Hunt in Dallas, the FBI began to visit my parents. Their telephone was tapped. They received harassing phone calls during the night. The harassment and brutality of this campaign was intended solely to provoke me into some drastic action. I had come from mountain people, and we never forget an injury, even if it takes 50 years to wreak our revenge. My temper remained under control only because my parents refused to let me know what was happening to them, and the ADL FBI provocation failed. Their campaign intensified, however, and one evening in 1961, my father, whose heart conditions had steadily gotten worse during this harassment, received a telephone call from a known FBI provocateur. "We've sent out a national alert to pick your son up." My father dropped the phone. They finally got him, he said to my mother, and he collapsed. He was taken to the hospital where he died of massive heart failure. It was more than 3 years went by as my mother told me what had happened. Of course, there had never been an alert, as I had never been arrested by anyone. In my life in Christ, I openly accused Lyndon Johnson, who was then President of America, of murdering my father, though he'd only been acting for Herbert Lehman, the Jew who had been supporting his bid for presidency. The only outcome of all this was during Johnson's presidency, every copy of my book that I mailed out was destroyed by the post office until I began insuring each copy. And this is what Eustace was still going through when I met him, when I went to his house. And now let's hear from Eustace personally.
Hello, I'm Bobby Lee, and this is the Bobby Lee Show. And today we have with us a very special guest. His name is Eustace Mullins. We have this book that Eustace Mullins wrote. It's called Murder by Injection, the story of the American medical conspiracy against America, against you and I. So it's Murder by Injection. Eustace Mullins, we're happy to have you with us today. Tell us a little bit about how did you come to write this book, Murder by Injection?
Well, I had been working for almost a half a century on the various monopolies, the legal monopoly, the banking monopoly, the secret government monopoly of the world. And I realized that all of these monopolies interacted, and about the same group of elitists, the world order people, were in each one. But I had not paid much attention to the medical profession. I thought, well, these are doctors who are curing people. They work in the hospital long hours, you know, and they're probably a public asset. And I thought that simply because I hadn't had any contact with them, fortunately for me. And other people who have had contact with them had a different view. Either they were furious, or they were disgusted, or they were dead. And so this was the status of the people who employed the medical profession in the United States, the average American citizen. And the doctors, during this period, as part of the drug trust and the medical monopoly, had various instruments furnished to them by the other monopolies. For instance, the oil monopoly of John D. Rockefeller at Standard Oil had gone into the petrochemical business, and through extensive research they had developed certain medications which they called wonder drugs, and the public, as they took these drugs, they would wonder what was going to happen to them. That's why they were wonder drugs. Others were called miracle drugs. They were called miracle drugs because if you took them and you survived, it was really a miracle. So this was the contribution of the monopolists to the medical monopoly. And the only thing that these drugs had in common was that they were enormously expensive. Now, in contrast, most of nature's remedies are enormously inexpensive. They're available, they're abundant, they're cheap, which means that the medical monopoly did not want you to use any of these medications. They wanted the greatest achievement of the modern drug trust was the invention of the $1,000 pill. They have now they have one pill which costs $1,000, which you use in cancer and various things. And nature, unfortunately, has never learned how to make a $1,000 pill. So obviously, nature is no good as far as the medical monopoly is concerned.
Well, tell us a little bit, just before we get into that also, there's a difference between homeopathic medicine and allopathic, and that's part of what we're discussing also. Tell us a little bit about that, if you would, Eustace Mullins.
Well, what you're talking about is a historic situation. In the 19th century, most Americans thrived on what is called homeopathic medicine, which is mostly naturopathic remedies available through nature in abundance at low cost. Well, the medical monopoly, which was formed in 1847 as the American Medical Association, they didn't like this. They thought, how are doctors going to get rich, and how are we going to control the people through the medical monopoly when they can go to these homeopathic people and get these remedies at very low cost? So the first plank of the AMA was, we will never allow any homeopathic physician to become a member of the AMA, and they never have. So, but the AMA was still in a minority. So around the turn of the century, John D. Rockefeller realized there were great potentialities of profit in the medical industry, and so he took over the medical profession. Now you say, how could anybody take over the medical profession? Well, first you have to have a lot of money, and second you have a lot of power. Well, he had both, and he did. So he revamped the entire medical system of treatment of the people of the United States, which had been homeopathic. He switched it over to allopathic medicine, which is a different type of practice, originating in Germany. And the great attraction of allopathic medicine is it relies on radical surgery. I mean, if you can't cure it, cut it off. And the heavy use of drugs, because when you're having your limbs cut off, you need a lot of drugs because it's very disturbing. And lengthy hospital stays, none of which are features of homeopathic medicine. It's entirely the reverse. So by taking over the medical industry in 1910, through studies which he made through the Carnegie Foundation, John D. Rockefeller emerged as the kingpin of the medical monopoly in the United States. And he now presided over an allopathic system of medicine controlled through every legislature by accreditation of hospitals, control of physicians, control of medications, and which is essentially what we have today. So from 1910, when this change was effected, right to the present day, the cost of health care has multiplied astronomically in the United States to the point where it is no longer available to most American citizens. So how did they counteract this? When they got us to the point where the average working man could not afford hospital care or the allopathic system of treatment, they set up an insurance industry, medical insurance. And through this, they were able to spread out the costs among everybody. And health insurance today is simply another tax on the American people. In fact, it functions through the Social Security system as a tax on the recipients of Social Security. You say, well, now that you've reached your senior citizen stank, you have Social Security coming in, so then they jerk back a good portion of it as Medicare costs, which they raise every year. And so eventually, probably, Social Security and Medicare will be equal, so you'll get a check every month, which will be 000. They say, well, here's your Social Security check, but we've deducted your Medicare costs, and so now you get zero.
And it's funneled into the Rockefeller-style monopoly, whoever is involved in it.
Oh, all of the money from the health industry goes into the medical monopoly and the drug trust. Interestingly enough, the Rockefellers control every major drug company in the world, and now when I say control, I mean directly. They have, among the directors and officials of each of the 18 largest drug companies in the world, they have men from Chase Manhattan Bank, from the Exxon oil company, and so forth. So they're right there. The names, I have all the names in my book, Murder by Injection. And with this kind of control and the monopoly, they have been jacking up the health costs on the American people monthly, not yearly, but monthly.
Mm-hmm. Well, $666 billion last year. That was a lot of money for this country to spend on health, and we're spending twice what many of the free world countries are spending. Japan and Germany, we're almost spending twice. And you say that this is part of the monopoly, and that's part of the reason that we're spending so much?
Well, actually, we're not spending it. The money is being stolen. Mm-hmm. The Washington Post carried a story not long ago in which they pointed out that the hospitals and the AMA physicians, and I'm not talking about quacks or cranks or fly-by-night people, I'm talking about the medical establishment. is stealing directly $77 billion a year in health costs from the American people. And does the Washington Post offer any solution to this? No, they say by 1995, the amount of theft will be more than $100 billion a year, stolen directly, plus all the other money that they get.
That's, ladies and gentlemen, that's why we're $4 trillion in debt. That's part of it anyway. So let's talk about the Hippocratic Oath, or maybe the Hypocrite's Oath, and Galen and Dr. Robert Mendelsohn. But what about the profits of cancer? Let's go into that, Eustace. How has cancer become profitable for people?
Well, you see, the medical industry, just like any other industry, they go for the big-ticket item, and cancer is a big-ticket item. I think the average cost of treating cancer is $120,000. And the interesting thing about it is when you go to a doctor and he says, oh, you have cancer, and he says, I really can't do anything for you, but I'm going to give you a lot of treatment. It's going to cost you a lot of money and a lot of pain. Your hair is going to fall out. You're going to wish you were dead, and sooner or later you will be. But meanwhile, we'll get all your money. This is called cancer treatment in the United States.
How did this start? How did this come about? Let's talk about radium before, because I think radium was one of the first cures, supposedly. Who developed the radium treatments? And tell us a little bit about that, if you would, Eustace Mullins.
Well, you know, there's a Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein aspect to modern medicine, where you have all of these mysterious machines throwing out various beams of light and radiation and so forth. And the person who's doing this, of course, is hopelessly insane. And when you go into modern treatment, you pretty much find that you're in a Frankenstein environment.
And you have to be pretty much insane to
well,
participate.
You wish you were insane, because if you're still conscious, it's pretty hard to endure what they put you through. And so modern cancer treatment originated with a doctor from South Carolina named Sims. And Dr. Sims apparently was just a common run-of-the-mill sadist, and he liked to operate on people not because he wanted to cure anything, but just to be cutting them up and, you know, having good, clean fun. And so the people in South Carolina, after they got onto him, they wouldn't let him touch them anymore. So he was reduced. He had to go and buy a slave girl. This is before the Civil War. He had to buy a slave girl for $500 so that he could cut her up. And then the people in the area were so outraged by what he was doing that they ran him out of town. So he went to New York, where his peculiarities would be less obvious. And he started a cancer hospital up there, and which was called Women's Hospital. And this was financed by a very wealthy lady named Melissa Phelps Dodge of the Phelps Dodge fortune, a great mining fortune. And so he ran this hospital for a while, and again the rumors started to creep out that there was a lot of torture and sadism going on in this hospital. I mean, you know, he didn't give up all of his fun just because he went to New York. That's where you go to have fun. And so he was going great guns. And so everybody at the hospital rebelled and said, get rid of Dr. Sims or we aren't coming back here anymore. Well, his wealthy patron, you know, they don't like for their lackeys to be criticized. So she ignored them all, and he continued. And this hospital later became Memorial Hospital, and then it was financed by a relative of hers named James S. Douglas of the Phelps Dodge Mining Corporation, and he was called the Copper King. Well, in his mining interests in Arizona, he had come across a lot of uranium, which he also mined, and he became fascinated with the possibilities of radium as a treatment of various diseases. So he experimented on his wife and daughter until they both died of radium poisoning, and he continued to experiment on himself, and he also died of radium poisoning. And so Memorial Hospital then was continued. The fact that all these people had died didn't discourage the doctors at all. I mean, the fact that the treatment kills you never has discouraged any doctor yet. And in fact, they say, well, he got a lot of relief, didn't he? And so then it became from Memorial Hospital, the name changed to Sloan Kettering after the great two automobile manufacturers, Alfred P. Sloan of General Motors and Charles Kettering, who invented the battery and the electrical system of the automobile. And their fortune was funneled into this Memorial Sloan Kettering Hospital, which became the center of cancer treatment of the entire world. I call it the Cancer Mausoleum there in New York City. And it looks like an old Egyptian mausoleum. So even though it had the names of Sloan Kettering on it, it was taken over entirely by the Rockefellers. Lawrence Rockefeller's on the board, and various of their people from Chase Manhattan Bank. When you read, and I have the list of directors of Sloan Kettering in my book, each one of them has a direct Rockefeller connection. All the cancer treatment in the United States stems from the work done at Sloan Kettering. And it's still principally based on radiation and on chemotherapy and radical surgery. And in fact, they had one treatment there which consisted of chopping the whole lower part of the body off on the theory that that would stop cancer. Well, everyone they tried this treatment on died, so
Well, it stopped cancer, right?
well, they say the operation was successful, but the patient died. That's modern medicine. And like I say, you lose a few and you win a few. So anyway, Sloan Kettering is the great cancer hospital, and the fact that it goes back to this lunatic named Dr. Sims doesn't bother them one bit.
Well, tell us a little bit about the difference today. What is chemotherapy, and can chemotherapy be helpful under certain circumstances?
Well, the theory behind all cancer treatment of the medical monopoly and the drug trust is that you destroy the offending cell. A cancer cell is a cell which supposedly has run amok and begins to grow wildly throughout the body, and it shuts off normal cells, it kills them, and that's how you die of cancer. Well, this approach, which is strictly allopathic, says you've got to destroy that offending cell first through radiation, and you burn it out, which means you burn up everything around it also, but that doesn't discourage anybody. And secondly, through chemotherapy, you find some very strong chemical which can be injected into the body. It'll go right to the offending cell and destroy it, and of course it also destroys everything around it. Now, the homeopathic cure for cancer is restore the immune system. In other words, the body can control cancer through its own native resources, its inner resources of isolating the offending cells and then destroying them or letting them starve. But actually, all allopathic remedies for cancer actually encourage the cancer. For instance, they always make exploratory surgery. Well, in cancer, once you cut anywhere in the flesh, the cancer will go throughout the entire body. The cancer cells just say, boy, what an opportunity. We can go everywhere now through this surgery, and so they do. So that's why they say in cancer treatment, oh, they opened him up and looked at him and said it's hopeless and sewed him back up. And that's exactly what happens, because once you cut into a cancer patient, he's gone anyway. So one of the great causes of the spread of cancer in the United States is our exposure to carcinogenic systems, mainly chemicals and pollutions in the air. So the allopathic system, the Rockefeller system of controlling cancer, once you have introduced carcinogenic substances into the system and you begin to have cancer, then their solution is to introduce even more carcinogenic substances into the system, which they call chemotherapy. And of course the patients die there too. And the great illustration of the success of chemotherapy was a very famous Senator Hubert Humphrey, who had been vice president, and he developed bladder cancer. And so they treated him for about a year and a half, and they said, what a great success it is that we're having with Senator Humphrey with chemotherapy. So then Hubert Humphrey finally was interviewed, and he said, chemotherapy is living death, and he died. So that's the only real illustration they ever had of the success of chemotherapy. And he denounced it. He had breath enough to denounce it before he died, because he had really been through misery like no human being should ever be subjected to. But not only do you have carcinogenic substances and pollution, but you also, a lot of the spread of cancer is due to the fluoridation of the water in our public supplies, which of course was done through the Chase Manhattan Bank and the Alco Aluminum Trust. And not many Americans realize that the water systems of our major cities were fluoridated in the 1950s because the head of the Public Health Service was Oscar Ewing, a former chairman of the Democratic National Commission, who was then giving a high-paying job in Washington, the Federal Security Agency, under which the Department of Health and Human Services functioned. And he had been a former attorney for the Aluminum Corporation of America, and they had this problem of disposing of the sodium fluoride, a byproduct of the manufacture of aluminum. It was very expensive. It was probably the most dangerous toxic substance known in the United States. And so they said, we've got to dispose of this somehow less expensively. And someone came up with the notion, and I call it a notion because there's never been any evidence for it, that if you put sodium fluoride in the water and a child under the age of 8 drank it, he would never have any cavities. So we got to do anything to help the little children, so they fluoridated all of the water of our cities. But then a congressman named Adolph Miller went on the floor of Congress March 27, 1952, and he gave a different story. He said there are no studies which show that sodium fluoride does anything for anybody, but he said, I did find that Oscar Ewing received a $775,000 bribe from the Aluminum Corporation of America to enforce sodium fluoride fluoridation of water in every major city in the United States. So you're drinking fluoridated water not because it helps your children's teeth, but because a federal official took a $775,000 bribe. This is the way things are done in Washington.
Medicine is big business, right?
Medicine is big business, and it pays well if you're in the right position at the right time. So Oscar Ewing took his bribe. He went to Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and he developed one of the biggest office complexes in the South, which is now filled with government offices since he was head of the Democratic National Commission. It's called the Triangle Research Corporation, and it made him and his family wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. That $775,000 was parlayed into a $50 million research center, owned entirely by the recipient of this bribe. So he got the research center, and we got the fluoridation. And the fluoridated water, one of the effects of this on the human system is it damages the immune system. In other words, your immune system, if you have been drinking fluoridated water over a period of time, 2 years or 10 years or so what, it loses its effectiveness. So it's no longer able to combat illnesses, particularly pernicious diseases and ailments like cancer. And AIDS also stems directly from the fluoridated water. Most of your AIDS victims came from large cities which had been the first to fluoridate the water. So
because of the immune system, it made it more susceptible?
More susceptible to AIDS. Now, the AIDS virus supposedly attacks the immune system, but the immune system has already been under attack for a long time from the person who's been drinking fluoridated water. So, really, what has happened when you get HIV virus is that it attacks an already weakened immune system. And so this is the real explanation of AIDS, and not because a little green monkey supposedly got together with a woman in the heart of Africa in some village, and suddenly everybody came down with AIDS all over the world. But, you know, the drug trust figures tell them anything, they'll swallow it because we've got the media and we tell them this.
Well, we've been swallowing enough drugs for a long time.
Well, we have indeed, yes.
Yeah, it's like we have been perpetually drugged over the last 50 years regardless.
But the drug trust and the Rockefellers, their treatment for cancer is called the cut, slash, and burn technique of curing. And, of course, it's sure death. It's a slow death. I mean, it's like the old Indians, you know, when they would capture you on the frontier in the early days of this country, and they would stake you out and torture you for 4 or 5 days or as long as you could last. Well, the doctors do the same thing when they diagnose cancer. That means you're in for a really long period of torture until you finally succumb.
What about the Cancer Society itself? I mean, people give a lot of money to the Cancer Society. Is that beneficial for them to do so?
Well, they have these annual cancer drives in which the people in all the small towns of America are forced to go out and collect money for the American Cancer Society, and I describe that as the the little people collecting money for the big rich. American Cancer Society is a big rich organization, and if you remember that it was founded at the Union League Club in New York City, the wealthiest club in New York, by John D. Rockefeller Jr. See, John D. Rockefeller Jr. was a great philanthropist, and he said, we're going to do something about cancer, so I am founding and I'm putting up the money for the American Cancer Society. See, the Rockefeller family has had a long-term commitment to cancer. See, the founder of the dynasty, old John D.'s father, William Rockefeller, was a carnival sideshow barker who sold bottles of mineral oil for $5 a piece, and he advertised himself as the great cancer specialist. And so he sold these all up and down through Pennsylvania and Ohio when he wasn't running from the law, because he also was a very famous horse thief. He also had 18 warrants out against him for rape. So it's just a very colorful character. And so John D. Rockefeller, his son, was just the opposite, because he was so horrified by his father's escapades, that he led a very bourgeois life, very quiet, very good family life, and devoted himself to making money. But he found out that at least his father had one asset, and that was that making money through cancer cures was a surefire thing. So the Rockefeller family today is the dynasty which is behind all the cancer treatment in the United States through the Sloan Kettering Cancer Mausoleum of New York City.
Well, what would you do, Eustace, if one of your very, very close relatives or friends had cancer? Would you just, where do you go? Do you go to the hospital? Do you have a checkup, or do you eat apricot juice, or what?
Well, I have a relative who has cancer. Has had it for 5 years. And unfortunately, he went the whole route. First, he had 25 radiation treatments. Then he had 34 chemotherapy treatments. And, and the cancer spread to his bones, because none of these things do anything to stop the cancer. It causes you a lot of misery, but it doesn't really affect the cancer. So he's had quite a difficult time of it.
Do you mean to tell me that chemotherapy really doesn't help, or can it help, or can't? I mean, is there any way? I mean, what about what about surgery? And you're saying that there's no way. Cancer, I mean, if you cut the area that's cancerous out, doesn't it have a stopping action? Or?
Well, you'll see feature stories in the press constantly where some individual somewhere, they found somebody who did have cancer and had this treatment, and so now they proudly announce the cancer is in total remission. In other words, there is no cancer there. And unfortunately, this is what the medical monopoly itself calls anecdotal medicine. In other words, you tell a story about something that happened to your grandfather or your nephew or somebody, and that the cancer went into remission. But there's absolutely no scientific basis for any of these claims. And the story that the medical monopoly puts out is this person was diagnosed as having cancer, and they went to the hospital and they had radiation or chemotherapy, and the cancer went into remission, and they've lived happily ever after. But there again, you have absolutely no way of evaluating this hype which is in the media.
I want to personally thank one of America's #1 patriots, Mr. Eustace Mullins, for his courage in being able to author a book of such significance in the face of the dynasties, the syndicates, and the anti-middle class establishment. Eustace, I thank you so much for being with us today. God bless you, and I want you back on the Bobby Lee Show soon.
Thank you, Bobby Lee. I'll look forward to it.
All right, there you had Eustace Mullins. Now I think I want to do this. Give you a little taste, just a few excerpts from my film, The True Face of Female. And David, your film will go out today as soon as I can get to the post office and make a copy here, another copy here. This is the Brinkerhoff Lecture, or The True Face of Female. commentary is from me, and it was filmed at the Gathering of Eagles in Phoenix and the Gathering of Eagles in Fort Worth, which was just a lecture that I put on.
Well, a few things have changed since our last expo. We now have Homeland Security. Do you feel any safer? We have a nice color code now. I like that. If it's orange out today, there's a risk, an increased risk of terrorist attack. What do you think that means? Does that mean we shouldn't go to the grocery store that day because there might be a terrorist laying in wait for us? We also have a war. It's almost over. For somehow, though, there's something that went wrong over in Iraq. We failed to find any weapons of mass destruction. Does that surprise anybody? Now, there's people out there, hey, we got to go after Saddam because he's got weapons of mass destruction. Guess what? They lied. Now, we're being sold a bill of goods called Homeland Security. It's a major part of the federal government. First reorganization of the federal government since we introduced communism in 1933. Roosevelt. Who, had a good teacher, Uncle Joe Stalin. We sent John Gentry to one of the first law enforcement briefings done by Homeland Security. It was done by a former FEMA official, the talk, named Colonel John Brinkerhoff. Colonel Brinkerhoff is noted in the military circles for his interpretation of posse comitatus. Now, how many of you know what posse comitatus is? Posse comitatus is a law in the United States that prevents someone from using the military against the American people. Brinkerhoff says in his published release, in his press release, that the president can authorize the use of troops against the American people. Brinkerhoff says the Congress can authorize the use of troops against the American people. Associated Press says they are using the troops against the American people in New York City, even now as we speak. And you've seen the pictures, black-suited troops quelling those communist demonstrators that don't want to go over and kill people. We're using the troops against the American people now, but what you're getting is simply a taste of it. Trevor, see if you can run. I'm going to run a little clip here. Hopefully you'll be able to see this. This is the Strategic Indirect Warfare Conference held at Sandia National Laboratories, 2002, this was just last year. The FEMA formula, 1 million Homeland Security troops.
Before joining FEMA, Colonel Brinkerhoff was a career senior executive in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. for Reserve Affairs. He is also Director of Manpower Programming, Director of Intergovernmental Affairs, and Special Assistant to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Reserve Affairs. Before joining the Civil Service, Colonel Brinkerhoff was an Army officer. He retired in 1974 after 24 years of active commissioned service in a variety of assignments in Korea, Germany, Vietnam, and the United States. While on active duty, he served 2 tours on the Army staff and 2 tours in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. For the last 7 years, he has been an adjunct research staff member for the Institute of Defense Analysis, I can say this, working on a variety of issues, including Homeland Defense. Ladies and gentlemen, Colonel John Brinkerhoff.
I'm going to talk to you today about catastrophic emergencies. And I'm going to suggest a way to improve our capability to deal with such emergencies.
Now he's talking about a catastrophic emergency. What is a catastrophic emergency? I'm going to move in here, John. So, a catastrophic emergency under Brinkerhoff could be a terrorist attack, a nuclear attack, a outbreak of a contagious disease. Smallpox comes to mind. Brinkerhoff says that one case of a disease like smallpox in a major American city could be construed a catastrophic event. Now, I told you on my radio show that your chances of being killed by a terrorist is about equal to getting eaten by a great white shark in Phoenix. The odds are that you will die of a car accident, diet sodas, or white flour long before any terrorist ever gets to you. Brinkerhoff's solution to this is to put more troops in the streets of America than we used to conquer Iraq. Roll it again.
Now, I find this discussion of strategic indirect warfare to be very pertinent and very timely. We are engaged in a global struggle against opponents who are outgunned in conventional means of waging war, and therefore will resort to indirect means to gain their goals. Their aim is destruction of the United States and the principles for which it stands. The enemy will not use direct means, for they are weak. They will proceed indirectly to terrorize us and any other nations who come to our assistance. They will proceed indirectly to kill Americans. They will proceed indirectly to disrupt our society and our economy. They will proceed indirectly to weaken our will and to win eventually. And one of our vulnerabilities is our reluctance to face up to unpleasant truths and make adequate preparations for catastrophic emergencies. I'm going to talk about the consequences of these catastrophic emergencies and the resources needed to deal with them adequately. I will focus on one particular kind of resource: armed, disciplined, organized, and trained military and police forces. And by comparing the demand for these military and police forces with the supply, I'm going to point out that it will take more armed, disciplined, organized, and trained people to do the job than we presently have. I'm going to suggest that we revive and revitalize, as an additional source of those armed, disciplined, organized, and trained forces, the state guards or the state defense forces, about which little is known.
This is basically bullshit. We don't have any armed, trained, disciplined state guards because all of them have been nationalized. These armed, trained, organized, disciplined troops that he mentions about 8 times in the video are not going to be your kids in the armed services. As a matter of fact, at the end of the interview, one of the participants said, I'm a Green Beret. I'm a former Green Beret. We were trained to go into a country and organize the people to defend themselves. Why not put teams of Green Berets out around America to go into the communities to teach people how to take care of themselves? Makes perfect sense to me. We did that in Vietnam. Why not do it here? Of course, you know, probably the only intelligent thing Bo Greitz ever said was that, you know, we could go over to Vietnam, we could go to Afghanistan, we could organize the people, we could train the people. Can't do shit here. Americans won't be organized, they won't be trained, and they won't cut off their TV sets. So where you got to get 500,000, 400 to 500,000, 400,000 is what we would need if we find one case of smallpox in a major metropolitan American city. You need those 500,000 troops, 400,000, who's quibbling over 100,000. He goes up to 1 million. Why would you need those troops in America? Did we need those troops when those planes flew into the World Trade Center? When somebody pushed a button and blew the buildings, and you know that's what happened. They went straight down. And they went down from the bottom, not the top. And what about building number 7? Oh, no plane hit that. Oops. Where were all of the looters? The only thing I saw watching the TV set was Americans trying to help Americans. I didn't see any troops pointing guns at each other. I saw firemen, I saw police, I saw Americans, I saw survivors getting in to try to help their fellow Americans. To me, that's what America's about. That's why I love America. That's why I'm not anti-American. That's why I'm not a communist.
I first want to say a few things about the nature of the war we're waging, because it influences how we're going to deal with catastrophic emergencies. The war on terrorism is going to be long, and it's going to be inconclusive. It will last for 40 years, like the Cold War, perhaps even longer. There will be a few major campaigns, a few big battles, and many, many very small engagements. Because it is going to be a long war, the United States has to settle in for the long haul and has to establish a means to wage war carefully and continuously and affordably over many years.
We're going to wage war carefully and continually over the next few years, and it may go longer. Now, the sound on the audio is bad. If you buy the tape and take it home and crank it all the way up, you'll be able to hear it. About like this. This is just the sound of the tape. We've tried to digitally enhance it. I don't want to destroy the continuity of the video, because it's really important that you take this and show this to your friends who think Homeland Security is going to do something good for them.
There will be no quick victory in this war. Americans like to win big with definite goals and come home and have parades. That will not happen. Operation Desert Storm was the epitome of the kind of war we really like. But it will not happen in this war. We will have to settle in for the long haul. The United States is now a theater of war. In previous wars of the 20th century, the United States was the zone of the interior, a secure base from which we could build the tanks, aircraft, and supplies, and ship them overseas to our troops fighting in the theaters of war. The war on terrorism is not like that. In this war, the United States is itself a theater of war. We need to understand the enemy. In the Cold War, we knew the capabilities of our enemy, but we did not know his intentions. In this war, we know the intentions of our enemy, but we do not know his capabilities. We have a lot to learn about that. The enemy is patient. The enemy will wait until we have been lulled again into a false sense of security, and then will strike to gain tactical surprise. The enemy is flexible. Future attacks will differ from past attacks. The terrorists have the initiative, and they select the time, the place, and the method which will suit their purposes. There will be more attacks. And although we will foil many attempts, some of those attacks will succeed. We'll have to take some losses, and we will have to rebound from those losses, absorb them, and overcome the defeats and carry on. We have to be prepared to respond and deal with the full range of emergencies, small and large. We have to take seriously the threat of terrorist attacks because they have the potential to kill large numbers of Americans, and they have the potential to devastate our economy and our society. I'm going to list and discuss 5 possible catastrophic emergencies among many that could happen. A major smallpox epidemic would be a catastrophic emergency. It would cause great fear in the populace, spread rapidly if unchecked, and would put into operation a federal program to inoculate great numbers of Americans against the disease. Vaccinating the entire population, or even a major part of the population in a few days, would itself be a major event and a major catastrophe.
This could be a, hold it right there. This could be, he says, an outbreak of smallpox. He says it could be an earthquake. You know, when San Francisco, the great San Francisco earthquake happened, where were all these foreign troops? Now, he makes it quite clear. We can't afford to use the National Guard. They're too expensive. We can't afford to use the Army Reserves because they're all going to be in Iraq, Iran, somewhere else. They've exported all of our young fighting men to one of these countries, Bosnia, Afghanistan, and it'll be Iran, Syria next. Where are they going to get the State Guard? They're already coming in. They're from the new European Union, which of course will include NATO. 10 new Soviet countries joined this week the European Union. Low cost. We have to have affordable troops. Well, those foreigners work cheap. We're sending even retired police officers are being removed from this country to go over to Iran to keep the peace. 400,000 to 1 million troops brought into this country to do what? To protect you. It's not to protect you, it's to isolate you, to force you to get a vaccine for smallpox. There's more. The Model State Health Act has been put into effect in almost every state. They passed it in New Mexico. I love the way they did this. On one hand, in the same, probably about the same session, they passed a resolution against condemning the American Patriot Act, or the first Patriot Act. And at the same time, they introduced the Model Health Act, which allows Governor Bill Richardson to transfer entire populations, move entire populations to quarantine, to isolate, to remove people from their homes. If you are removed from your home for a medical emergency, you cannot bring your guns with you. A lady, one of my listeners from New Jersey, called today and said they just released, in case of a terrorist attack in New Jersey, bring all your valuables with you, your gold, your diamonds, your stocks, and your bonds, and report to the check-in center. You won't find me there, and Brinkerhoff knows that. I took it a little personal when he said, you know, there's a small segment of people that simply won't follow orders. And there is a little bit more. Here, again, you know, if I read this on the air, I'm a right-wing extremist. This is Gannett News. This is USA Today. If the nation escalates to red alert, which is the highest color-coded readiness against terror, you will be assumed by the authorities to be the enemy if you so much as venture outside of your home, the state's anti-terror czar says. The state is on top of it. And that's from Sid Capperson, New Jersey's director of the Office of Counterterrorism. Capperson, a former FBI agent, was briefing reporters alongside Governor James E. McGreevey when, for the first time, he disclosed the realities of how a red alert would shut the state down. Red means all non-critical functions cease. Non-critical would be almost all businesses except health-related. So much for your business. Red alert means there's a severe risk of terrorist attack. The state will restrict transportation and access to critical locations, says the state's new brochure on dealing with terrorism. The government agencies would run it a very low threshold. The state police and emergency management people would take controls over the highways. You literally are staying home is what happens unless you're required to be out, no different than if you had a state of emergency with a snowstorm. My ass. I've been in a lot of snowstorms.
A New Madrid earthquake of a magnitude 8.5 or more on the Richter scale would be a catastrophic emergency. The largest earthquake recorded in the United States occurred along the New Madrid Fault in southern Missouri on 16 December 1811. It had a magnitude of 8.5 on the Richter scale. Although the effects of the earthquake were severe, the damage was limited because at that time the area was sparsely populated. If such an earthquake were to occur today, it would kill 5,000 people outright, injure 50,000, leave 500,000 homeless, and disrupt essential services to 20 people in a 7-state region in the heartland of America. Seismologists say that it's not a question of if another New Madrid earthquake will occur, but when. Detonation of a nuclear weapon of even small yield, less than 5 kilotons, would be a catastrophic emergency. Those in the immediate vicinity of the detonation would be killed by blast and thermal effects. Those who survived the direct effects could be killed, injured, or made sick by secondary fires or gamma radiation from the fallout. The greatest danger to the large mass of people would be radioactive fallout, which can be detected only by radiation meters, but can be defended against by relatively simple measures. Such a detonation occurring in a metropolitan area would cause panic, spontaneous evacuation, and great chaos as survivors sought to leave the area by any means. Those of us who spent some time planning and preparing for a massive Soviet nuclear attack during the Cold War understand the dangers and the remedies. But people today have little knowledge or understanding of how to respond to this kind of attack or of the effects of a nuclear attack. A major anthrax attack on New York City would be a catastrophic emergency. According to Dexter Ingram of the Heritage Foundation, if 440 pounds of anthrax were released over New York City, there would be a probability of from 50 to 90% of 1.2 million deaths, like about 600,000 to 800,000 people killed by the anthrax. Mr. Ingram obtained his data from a computer program. It's called the Consequences Assessment Toolset, or CATS, which is operated by the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. The impact of 500,000 or 900,000 deaths in a metropolitan area, and even more people seriously ill would have to be treated either before they die or as survivors, would have a catastrophic impact on the city, would require stern measures to give some of the ill people a chance to survive.
He gets personal a little bit later in this. He says, you know, we have to train these folks because there's a few of them out, a few of you out there, a few people out there that simply won't follow orders. They won't stand in line for their smallpox shot. They won't stand in line to get a bottle of potassium iodate. They won't take orders from foreign troops. Now, if we don't have 500,000 armed, ready troops here in America, where are you going to get them? And it's got to be affordable, too. National Guard just costs too much. The Army costs too much, so we got to bring somebody in. Now, he talks about State Guard. That's simply to put you off. He also talks about people that are authorized to carry weapons. Excuse me? I'm authorized to carry weapons because it's called the Second Amendment of the Constitution of the United States. Now, hopefully you can see what's happening here. What happened at Waco was wrong. It was morally wrong. It was also illegal. They overstepped their bounds and they committed murder on the American people. It was illegal under posse comitatus, which has been around for 100 years. Brinkerhoff's going to talk about that. He's going to tell you that posse comitatus doesn't matter, and I've talked, he says, to the chiefs of staff, and they've come around to my way of thinking. Who the hell's this? Brinkerhoff, Colonel Brinkerhoff, FEMA, Homeland Security now. That's who we're talking about.
Even 500,000 dead bodies in that small area would in itself be a catastrophic emergency requiring outside assistance, great outside assistance. Finally, prolonged disruption of electrical power service to a major metropolitan area like Washington, D.C., Southern California, or even Albuquerque, New Mexico, would be a catastrophic emergency. Most of you have experienced power outages. They are not much trouble if they only last 2 or 3 hours, but if they last much longer, the novelty wears off, and they become real nuisances. After going without power for a day or two, the outage becomes a real problem. If it lasts a week or more, it is a catastrophic emergency accompanied by civil disorder. In July 1975, New York City experienced a power outage that lasted 24 hours. The outage was caused by lightning that cut key power lines from the north concurrently. During the 24-hour blackout period, some of the occupants of New York City went on a rampage of disorder and crime. There were 1,700 false alarms, 1,000 fires, and 3,700 arrests. And those are only part of the arrests that could have been made and should have been made. In 3 neighborhoods, the Upper West Side, East Harlem, and downtown Brooklyn, there was over $300 million of damage done. According to the Post newspaper of the time, New York was transformed into a series of seething battlefields. A power outage that lasts several days or a few weeks could threaten the very fabric of society. Cars would not run because pumps would not be available to provide the fuel. Food would rot. Trash would not be hauled away. ATMs would not work, and neither would the credit cards. Americans don't know how to survive in a world without electricity. We have made ourselves vulnerable to disruption. Take a few minutes and think about it. What would you do if the power went out and you could not get food for your family? Now, if you believe I'm overstating the problem, I recommend you see a movie called The Trigger Effect. It's not really a very good movie. And I couldn't get it at the usual video rental store, so I had to order it off the internet. But I watched it. The plot is an extended power outage in Southern California, and 3 people try to survive during a very difficult period. The outage lasts only 3 days, but violence erupts as people scramble to survive. Propensity for individual and mob violence in catastrophic emergencies is great. It's even great in some smaller emergencies. The people of the United States are saturated with violence. The popular culture exalts violence. A thin veneer of civility lies between chaos and us. Lest you think I'm exaggerating, let call your attention to increased violence at sporting events. From Little League to the National Football League, players, parents of players, and fans are increasingly taking out on each other their frustrations with bad calls, or losing the game, or even winning the game. The violence at professional football games in Washington, D.C. is so great that parents will refuse to take their children out to the stadium anymore. Read the newspapers. You'll see about violence. It permeates our society. Now, if violence is now the norm over small things, just ponder on how bad it will be during a catastrophic emergency. We in emergency management have always held that Americans pull together in emergencies and cooperate for the common good. That remains true, but an increasing minority of Americans will also resort to violence to get what they believe is good for them. Armed, disciplined, organized and trained personnel are needed to maintain law and order, manage the orderly movement of large numbers of people, secure facilities and installations, and provide or manage the provision of essential supplies and services. These duties must be done by police officers and military personnel who are entitled to bear arms as members of legal law enforcement agencies, the Armed Forces of the United States, and the duly constituted militia, the State Guard.
They ain't talking about you. We are the militia, every American, but they aren't talking about you. And, you know, I thought we were authorized to bear arms by the Second Amendment. I don't know where Brinkerhoff comes from, but it ain't this planet. This out on April 4th. President Bush issued an executive order on Friday that allowed the forced quarantine of patients with a mysterious new illness that has killed 80 people, as well as patients with other diseases such as Ebola. The order allows Health and Human Services Secretary to decide when such a quarantine is needed. It calls for the apprehension, detention, or conditional release of individuals to prevent the introduction, transmission, or spread of suspected communicable diseases. It names severe acute respiratory syndrome, which has affected a suspected 115 people in the United States and 2,400 worldwide, killing 80. It also names diphtheria, tuberculosis, plague, smallpox, yellow fever, and Ebola, Lassa, and Marburg hemorrhagic fevers. You know what SARS is? Well, they say it's a man-made disease. They're trying to find it right now. It's coronavirus. Whole planes have been embargoed and held in quarantine when they flew into San Francisco from one of the infected agency areas around Hong Kong. Basically, if you have allergies, if you have a cold, if you're sneezing or sniffling in an area like San Francisco or someplace like that, they could actually literally pick you up off the streets right now, physically hold you and test you until they found out whether you had the SARS virus or if you just had a cocaine hangover. They can pick you up. They can, if it happens in Dallas or Fort Worth, they would need, according to FEMA, and this is not somebody off the street. This is not a right-wing extremist. This is not a communist. This is Homeland Security telling you this. Need 400,000 troops to surround the area. We'll check you. We'll round you all up. You report to your local Kmart. We'll give you your smallpox shot. We're going to develop a vaccine. I'm sure that somebody will develop a vaccine for SARS. We've never been able to cure the cold right now. Most of and I don't know how many Americans, probably somebody you know in your family, when they got old, died of pneumonia. Suddenly it's become a communicable disease. This is the future that we have to look forward to. It's probably only a matter of time before the uninformed people out there, the frightened people, and this is what it's all about, to frighten you. I'm not intending to frighten you. I want to piss you off. I want to make you mad. I want you to be asking your congressmen and your senators and your neighbors, what the hell is going on here? Do you want to be walking around with a mask on? They have them in designer colors, and I think they ripped that off from me. Hey, let's do paisley face mask. It was in the paper the next day. I don't know how many government officials listen to my show, but 3 days after I talked about buying a town in called Playas, New Mexico, Senator Pete Domenici got on nationwide television and said, I think we're going to buy Playas, New Mexico. It would make a good counter-terrorist training camp, which is why we didn't get Playas, New Mexico. We wanted to buy the town. We offered them the full $3.2 million. We could have raised it, and they turned us down. You can't buy it. You know, that militia guy from Albuquerque, he wanted to come down here. They told John, my cameraman, he wanted to come down here and shoot wetbacks. Life in America is going to change. I am not like Alex Jones. I'm not like a lot of your talk show hosts. I don't want to scare you. I want you mad. I want you to stand up for yourself. I want you to stand up for your children and your families. And I want to find answers. I'm not worried about the New World Order taking over, because they took over long before you and I were born. What we're seeing is methods of control, methods of containment, methods of separation. If you're a Republican, you hate the Democrats. If you're a Democrat, you hate the Republicans. It keeps you apart, and you stop talking about your basic liberties.
So, when catastrophic emergencies occur, large numbers of additional armed, disciplined, organized, and trained personnel will be needed to restore order, prevent looting, hold down criminal activities, and protect innocent bystanders. Now, catastrophic emergencies will cause mass movements of people. They will seek to escape the danger and find refuge elsewhere. Some of this mass movement will be part of pre-planned evacuation plans. The D.C. Council of Governments has an evacuation plan to get people out of the D.C. and the suburbs surrounding D.C. I don't know whether they've informed the rural areas on the outskirts of that intention, and probably not, but that's where they plan to go. And of course, people will go by themselves, because people aren't dumb. They evacuate spontaneously and will do so. Either way, managing the movement out of the danger areas into the secure areas will take large numbers of trained personnel to control traffic, arrange for essential support en route, and see to the resettling in the destination areas. Many of these evacuation managers have to be police or military personnel to assure positive control of the bulk of the people who will obey orders, and handle also the minority people who will not obey orders and who will resist authority and disrupt the movement. Armed, disciplined, organized, and trained troops are needed to provide physical security for key installations before, during, and after an attack, and perhaps for extended periods of time. Another task for military troops in particular is to provide emergency supplies and services. This will be needed during the initial period of a catastrophic emergency, when normal commercial distribution systems are completely disrupted. Now, I've made some estimates of the numbers of armed, disciplined,